The wind carried the scent of dry grass and warm dust across the wide Texas plain as Daniel rode his old brown horse toward the ranch. The sun had just started to drop behind the distant hills, painting the sky with streaks of gold and orange. He had been on the road for days, working from one small town to another, offering his hands to whoever needed help fixing fences, branding cattle, or mending roofs. He wasn't born into ranch life, but he had learned how to survive in it, the hard way. Daniel was 28, tall, quiet, and strong from years of hard work. His father had been a coal miner back east, and his mother had passed when he was young. The world had made him tough, but it hadn't made him unkind. When he came across a place that looked honest, he always offered his help. And that's how he arrived at the Hollow Creek Ranch that evening. The ranch belonged to Ruth and Thomas Granger, a family known for their fine horses and fair dealings. But more than their cattle or fences, what caught Daniel's attention was their daughter, Mary Granger, a young woman with steady eyes and a warm smile. She was out by the corral brushing the mane of a chestnut mare when Daniel approached. "Evening, ma'am," he said politely, taking off his hat. "I'm looking for work, fencing, hauling, or just about anything that needs doing." Mary looked at him, her hands still moving gently through the horse's mane. "My father's inside. You can talk to him. He always needs strong hands after a storm like last week's." Daniel nodded, thankful. "Much obliged," he said, and tied his horse near the barn. He didn't know it then, but that simple meeting would lead him into one of the most testing times of his life, not just of his body, but of his heart. Inside, the ranch house smelled of stew and wood smoke. Thomas Granger, a man with silver hair and sharp eyes, listened quietly as Daniel explained he was looking for honest work and fair pay. After a moment, Thomas nodded. "You can start tomorrow. But you'll stay in the bunkhouse, and I expect early mornings and no nonsense." Daniel agreed instantly. He wasn't one for talking much. Hard work didn't scare him. What did make him uneasy, however, was the woman watching from the kitchen doorway, Mrs. Ruth Granger. Her eyes were sharp, like she could see right through him. She had a way of standing, tall, steady, commanding, like a person who had carried her family through storms and wasn't about to let a stranger disturb her peace. "Dinner's almost ready," Ruth said in a voice that left no room for refusal. "You'll eat with us tonight since you're new." It was rare for a ranch hand to be invited to the family's table. Usually workers ate apart. But Daniel could tell this wasn't kindness, and it was a test. Ruth wanted to see what kind of man he was. When they sat down to dinner, the air felt different. The table was filled with simple food: cornbread, beans, roasted chicken, and a jug of cold water. Thomas bowed his head and said grace. Daniel followed respectfully. When the prayer ended, Ruth began to serve the plates. "So," she said finally, her eyes on Daniel. "You've been traveling a lot?" "Yes, ma'am," Daniel said, his tone even. "Work's been scarce in the South, so I move where it's needed." "And no family?" she asked. Daniel shook his head. "No, ma'am. Not anymore." There was a short silence. The clinking of forks filled the air. Mary watched quietly, her eyes curious but kind. Ruth, however, didn't soften. "A man without roots can be a problem," she said firmly. "Hard to trust someone who can ride off whenever he wants." Daniel met her eyes. "That's fair, ma'am. But when I give my word, I keep it. My roots are in what I do, not where I stand." Thomas chuckled a little as if he respected that answer, but Ruth didn't smile. She studied Daniel as though he were an old horse she wasn't sure she wanted to buy. After dinner, Daniel offered to wash the dishes. Ruth almost refused, but Mary spoke up. "Let him, Mama, he's our guest." Ruth hesitated but agreed. As Daniel stood at the sink washing plates under the dim oil lamp, Mary dried them beside him. Their hands brushed once, and she smiled shyly. "You don't talk much, do you?" she said softly. "No, ma'am." "Words don't fix fences," Daniel replied, and she laughed. A quiet, gentle laugh that made the room feel warmer. By the time the dishes were done, the house had grown quiet. Thomas went out to check on the horses. Mary disappeared into her room. But Ruth stayed behind, sitting at the table watching Daniel finish his chore. When he turned to say goodnight, she spoke, her voice calm but serious. "Daniel," she said, "you seem like a good worker. But I don't let just anyone stay on this ranch. I've seen men talk nice, eat our food, then run off when things get hard. If you're going to stay here, you'll have to prove yourself. Not just with your hands, but with your heart." Daniel stood still, unsure what she meant. "I'll do what's right, ma'am," he said. Ruth nodded slowly as though she had expected that answer. Tomorrow morning we'll see, she said, and then she stood, gathering her shawl around her shoulders. You'll know what I mean by sunrise. When Daniel stepped outside, the air had cooled. Crickets chirped from the grass, and the stars spread wide over the land like silver dust. He walked to the bunkhouse, laid down his blanket, and stared at the ceiling made of old wood planks. He couldn't shake Ruth's words. What kind of test would a rancher's wife give him? He'd fixed fences, ridden wild horses, even faced coyotes alone at night. But something told him this would be different. This wouldn't be about work. It would be about trust, respect, and strength of character. The kind of test that could decide whether he'd be welcome under that roof. Or sent away at dawn. Outside, the wind whispered through the mesquite trees, and the ranch slept quietly. But Daniel lay awake, thinking about the look in Ruth's eyes, and the quiet kindness in Mary's smile. He didn't know it yet, but by the next evening, both women would see what kind of man he truly was. The morning came early, painted in soft orange light across the open land. The roosters called from somewhere near the barn, and the horses stamped their hooves ready to be fed. Daniel woke before the sun fully rose, just as he always did when there was work to do. He washed his face with cold water from the pump outside the bunkhouse and pulled on his worn boots. The air was cool and sharp, the kind that cleared a man's head. But in Daniel's mind, there was still that one thought from the night before, Mrs. Ruth Granger's words. Tomorrow morning, we'll see. He didn't know what kind of test she had planned, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to fail it. By the time he walked up to the barn, Ruth was already there. Her dress was simple, her gray hair tied back and her sleeves rolled up like she meant business. Mary stood beside her, brushing the same chestnut horse Daniel had seen the day before. Thomas was nowhere to be seen. You're early, Ruth said, her eyes cold but curious. Yes, ma'am, Daniel replied. Sun's up, so I should be too, Ruth nodded. Good. Let's see if your hands work as well as your manners. She handed him a pitchfork and pointed toward the large barnyard behind the stables. We lost part of the fence in the storm last week. The posts need replacing, and the ground's hard as rock. My husband's off buying supplies, so you'll do it alone today. By sundown, I want that fence standing straight. Daniel didn't flinch. Yes, ma'am, he said simply. Mary looked like she wanted to say something, but Ruth gave her a sharp glance and she stayed quiet. Daniel set to work right away. The ground was uneven, and the broken posts were buried deep in dried mud. He used his shovel and his strength to dig out the old wood. The sun rose higher, turning the sky pale blue, and soon the heat began to press down on his back. Sweat ran down his neck, soaking his shirt, but he didn't stop. From the porch, Ruth watched him. She didn't say a word, but her eyes followed his every move. To her, this wasn't just about fixing a fence. It was about seeing what kind of man Daniel truly was. Many had come before, strong and full of promises, only to give up when the work got tough. Ruth had learned to read people by how they worked, not how they talked. Around noon, Mary brought out a jug of water and a small lunch wrapped in cloth. Mama said you should take a break, she said softly. Daniel smiled faintly. That's kind of her. But I'll eat once I finish this post. It's easier to rest when something's done. Mary stayed for a moment, watching him hammer the wood into place. His movements were strong but careful, not the kind of wild strength that breaks more than it fixes. You're not like most men who come through here, she said. Daniel looked up, surprised. How's that? They talk too much, Mary said with a small grin. You don't say much at all, but you get things done. Daniel gave a quiet nod. Talking doesn't make the sun move faster. Mary smiled again, and for a brief second her mother's sternness seemed far away. But just as she turned to go, Ruth appeared in the doorway. Mary, she called, get back inside. Let the man work. Mary nodded and walked away, leaving Daniel with a respectful silence. The rest of the day stretched long and heavy. The sun beat down, the wind picked up dust, and Daniel's hands began to ache from holding the hammer. But every time he looked up, he saw Ruth still watching. Her arms crossed, expression unreadable. By sunset, the new fence stood straight and solid, a line of fresh wood that gleamed in the fading light. Daniel wiped his forehead and leaned on the last post. His shirt was soaked and his muscles trembled from exhaustion, but his eyes were steady. Ruth walked down from the porch, her boots crunching on the dry ground. She examined the fence carefully, touching one of the posts and nodding to herself. "You did good work," she said. Most men would have stopped halfway. "Thank you, ma'am," Daniel said. "I don't stop when there's still light to use." Ruth looked at him, and for the first time there was something like respect in her eyes, though she didn't say it out loud. Instead, she asked, "Can you ride?" "Yes, ma'am," he replied. "Then tomorrow you'll join Mary on the trail to deliver feed to the south pasture. The road is rough and the horse can be stubborn. I want to see if you can handle both." Daniel nodded again. He didn't argue or question. That's how he was, calm, steady, and focused. That night during supper, Thomas had returned and listened as Ruth quietly explained how Daniel had rebuilt the fence alone. "The boy works hard," Thomas said, pouring himself some coffee. "He reminds me of myself when I first started." Ruth didn't answer. She looked across the table at Daniel and said, "We'll see how long that lasts." Mary frowned a little. "Mama, he's done everything you asked without a complaint." Ruth turned to her daughter. "And that's what every man does in the beginning. The true measure comes later." Daniel didn't respond. He simply finished his food, thanked them again for the meal, and went out to check on the horses before bed. Outside, the night air was cool and quiet. The stars looked brighter than before, and the smell of hay and earth surrounded him. As he brushed down his horse, he heard footsteps behind him. It was Mary holding a lantern. "Thank you for working so hard today," she said softly. "Mama can be strict, but she means well. She's seen a lot of people come and go." Daniel smiled faintly. "I understand. A family like this doesn't stay strong by trusting too quick." Mary nodded, then hesitated. "She tests everyone who gets close to us," she admitted. "Not just workers, and anyone who wants to stay." Daniel looked at her, realizing what she meant. "You mean me?" She looked down. "Maybe. But I think she's already starting to believe in you. She just doesn't want to show it yet." For a moment they stood in the quiet barn, the horses shifting gently in their stalls. Then Mary smiled and said, "Good night, Daniel." "Good night, ma'am," he replied politely. After she left, Daniel leaned against the stall door, thinking about her words. He didn't mind hard work, but proving himself to someone's family was a different kind of labor. It wasn't just about sweat or strength. It was about patience, respect, and showing he could stand firm even under doubt. The next morning came with a pale sky and cool air. Mary was already saddling the horses when Daniel arrived. Ruth stood nearby, arms crossed again, watching. "The road to the south pasture is long," she warned. "There are coyotes, uneven ground, and broken fences. Don't let anything happen to my daughter or to the supplies." Daniel nodded seriously. "I'll see to it, ma'am." Ruth gave a small, almost hidden nod. "Then go. Let's see what kind of man you really are." Mary smiled nervously, and together they rode out of the ranch yard, their horses' hooves kicking up soft dust. From the porch, Ruth watched until they disappeared into the open land. Her face softened just a little as she whispered to herself, "Let's see if he can protect what he claims to respect." Out on the trail, Daniel rode a few paces ahead, scanning the horizon. The air smelled of sagebrush and freedom, but deep down he knew this was the real test. Not just to prove his worth to Ruth Granger, but to prove to himself that he could be the kind of man who didn't run from trust, love, or challenge. And somewhere between the hills and the open sky, his journey with the rancher's family was just beginning. The trail stretched wide and rough beneath the horses' hooves, winding through open grasslands and dusty hills. The morning sun rose slow and steady, warming the cool air and bringing light to the quiet world. Mary rode beside Daniel, her brown hair tied under a light hat, and her eyes scanning the horizon with calm confidence. She had been raised on the ranch and knew these paths well. Daniel, though new, moved like a man used to long rides and uncertain ground. Behind them, 2 mules carried sacks of feed bound for the southern pasture. The journey would take half the day, maybe longer, and the road wasn't easy. Still, Daniel didn't complain. His focus stayed sharp. Every sound, every movement in the tall grass caught his attention. For the first hour, the only sounds were the creak of saddle leather and the soft rhythm of hooves. Mary finally broke the silence. "You don't say much," she said, glancing at him. Daniel smiled slightly. "Talking doesn't make the trail shorter." Mary laughed. "That's what Mama says too," he nodded. "She seems like a woman who's seen a lot." Mary grew quiet for a moment, then said softly, "She has. My father got hurt once, years ago, when a fence collapsed on him during a storm. He couldn't work for months. Mama ran the ranch, kept the workers in line, and made sure no one took advantage of us. She learned to be strong the hard way." Daniel listened carefully. "That kind of strength comes with a price," he said. "You learn to protect everything, even when it's safe." Mary looked at him, surprised by his understanding. "Maybe that's why she's testing you," she said. "She wants to see if you're strong, not just with your hands, but with your heart." Daniel didn't answer right away. He looked ahead, watching how the sunlight glimmered on the far ridge. "Then I'll pass her test," he said quietly. "One way or another." They continued riding until the ranch buildings disappeared behind them, replaced by open fields and rocky slopes. Around midday, they stopped by a shallow creek to water the horses and rest. The air was still, but in the distance, dark clouds gathered on the horizon, the kind that carried wind and sudden rain. "Storm's moving in," Daniel said, studying the sky. "We'd better hurry." Mary nodded, but before they could mount again, one of the mules stumbled. Its load had shifted and the feed sack tore open, spilling grain across the ground. Mary groaned softly. "Oh no, that's half our supply." Daniel moved quickly. "Don't worry. I'll fix it." He took off his coat, tied the torn section tight with rope, and hoisted the sack back onto the mule. His movements were sure and efficient, every motion done with purpose. Mary watched him silently, impressed. "You really do know what you're doing," she said with a smile. "I've carried worse on worse roads," Daniel replied with a grin. "This is nothing new." They started again, moving faster now as the wind picked up. The trail curved between two ridges where the land grew steeper. The mules began to tire, and the sound of thunder rolled faintly across the sky. By late afternoon, the storm was close. The wind howled through the grass and dust swirled around them. The horses grew restless, their ears twitching. "We should find shelter," Mary shouted over the wind. Daniel nodded, pointing toward a line of rocky cliffs ahead. "There, we'll wait it out." They pushed through the wind and rain until they reached the shelter of the rocks. Lightning flashed behind the hills and the rain began to pour, heavy and cold. Daniel helped Mary down from her horse and guided her toward a small hollow under the cliffside. "Stay here," he said. "I'll tie the animals." Mary nodded, pulling her shawl tight around her shoulders. She watched as Daniel braved the wind, securing the horses and mules to nearby rocks. When he returned, soaked but calm, she handed him a blanket from one of the packs. "You're freezing," she said. He smiled faintly. "I've been through worse." They sat under the rocky ledge, listening to the storm rage around them. The sound of rain hitting the earth filled the silence, along with distant thunder that echoed like rolling drums. After a while, Mary spoke again, her voice quiet but steady. "You didn't have to come on this trip, you know. Mama just wanted to test you." "I figured," Daniel said. "But I'm glad I came. You learn a lot about people when things get hard." Mary looked at him, curious. "And what did you learn today?" "That your mother's right," Daniel said. "This land tests everyone, men, women, even the animals. Only the ones who stay calm, keep working, and don't give up make it through." Mary smiled softly. "That sounds like something my father would say." The storm lasted another hour before the rain began to fade. The sky darkened into evening and the air turned cold. Daniel built a small fire with the dry kindling he had packed in a leather pouch. The flames flickered gently, casting warm light on the rough walls of the hollow. Mary stared into the fire, thoughtful. "You remind me of my father," she said after a long pause. "Not because you look like him, but because you're steady. He always said real strength isn't loud, and it's quiet and patient." Daniel nodded slowly. "I think your father's a wise man." "He is," she said with a proud smile. "But he trusts Mama more than anyone. If she believes in someone, he does too." Daniel looked into the fire, his expression serious. "Then I hope someday she'll believe in me." Outside, the rain finally stopped. The storm clouds drifted away and the stars began to appear one by one. The air smelled of wet earth and clean wind. When morning came, they continued their journey. The ground was muddy and the trail slippery, but Daniel guided the animals carefully. By noon, they reached the south pasture, a wide stretch of land where the cattle grazed under the bright sky. They unloaded the feed, spread it near the troughs, and checked the fences. Some were loose, others broken from the wind. Daniel repaired what he could while Mary helped gather the scattered supplies. As they worked, Mary's horse suddenly neighed and reared. A rattlesnake had slithered near its hoof. Mary froze in fear, unable to move. In a single motion, Daniel grabbed a long stick from the ground and struck near the snake, driving it away into the brush. His movements were quick, not panicked. When it was gone, he turned to Mary. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded, still pale. You saved me." Daniel shook his head. "I just did what anyone should." "No," she said softly. "Not everyone would have acted so fast." He gave a small, calm smile. "You'd have done the same for me." They finished the work and started their way home in the late afternoon. The air was fresh and the land shimmered under the returning sunlight. As they rode, Mary looked at Daniel with a quiet admiration that she didn't try to hide anymore. By the time they reached the ranch, Ruth was already waiting near the barn. She stood with her arms folded, watching as they dismounted. Her eyes went straight to Mary. "Everything all right?" she asked sharply. "Yes, Mama," Mary said. "We made it. The fence is fixed and the feed's delivered. Daniel did everything perfectly, even saved me from a snake." Ruth turned to Daniel, studying him silently. "A snake?" "Yes, ma'am," Daniel said. "Just a small one near her horse. No harm done?" Ruth's expression didn't change much, but her eyes softened for the first time. "You did well," she said finally. "You brought my daughter home safe. Not every man could have handled that trail or that storm." Daniel nodded respectfully. "Thank you, ma'am." Ruth paused, then said, "You've passed one part of my test. But you should know, the hardest part isn't done yet." Mary frowned. "Mama," Ruth raised her hand gently. "He's earned my respect for his strength. Now, I need to know if he has something rarer. Honesty." Daniel met her eyes steadily. "I'll answer anything you ask, ma'am." Ruth nodded. "Good. Then tomorrow morning you'll come inside. We'll talk, not about work, but about who you really are." As Daniel walked back to the bunkhouse that night, the stars shimmered above him, and the wind blew softly through the grass. He felt tired but peaceful. Whatever test Ruth Granger had planned next, he was ready. Because by now it wasn't just about proving himself. It was about belonging somewhere, maybe for the first time in his life. The morning sun rose quietly over Hollow Creek Ranch. The fields were still wet from the night dew, and the faint smell of hay floated through the air. Daniel woke up earlier than usual, his thoughts heavy with what Ruth Granger had said the night before. "Tomorrow morning you'll come inside. We'll talk. Not about work, but about who you really are." Those words stayed with him like a weight in his chest. He had faced storms, broken fences, and long rides, but this was different. This was about his past, his truth, and his worth as a man. He washed his face in the cold water by the pump, brushed the dust from his coat, and made his way toward the ranch house. The front porch creaked softly under his boots. From inside he could hear quiet voices, Ruth, Thomas, and Mary talking over breakfast. When he knocked gently on the door, Ruth's voice called out, "Come in." Daniel stepped inside. The warmth of the fire met the cool morning air, and the smell of coffee filled the room. Ruth sat at the table, straight-backed as always, while Thomas leaned back in his chair, calm but curious. Mary sat between them, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "Sit down, Daniel," Ruth said firmly. He removed his hat and took a seat. His eyes moved from Ruth to Thomas, then to Mary. The room felt still, not tense but expectant, like the air before a storm. Ruth spoke first. "You've worked hard these past few days. You built our fence, fixed our pasture, and brought my daughter home safe. For that you have my thanks," Daniel nodded. "I was just doing what's right, ma'am." Ruth's eyes didn't soften. "Doing right is easy when someone's watching," she said. "The real test comes when no one is." Daniel met her gaze. "Yes, ma'am." Thomas cleared his throat. "Ruth wants to know more about you," he said, his voice calm and even. "Where you come from, who your people are, and what you've been running from." Daniel's eyes lowered for a moment. He had expected this question. Every man had a story, and not all stories were clean. But he wasn't a liar, and he wasn't about to start now. "I was born in Kansas," Daniel began quietly. "My father was a coal miner. My mother passed when I was 12. After that, it was just the two of us. When my father died in a cave-in, I was 19. I worked wherever I could, farms, mills, small ranches. But work dried up and I kept moving." Ruth listened closely. "And in all those years," she said, "you never settled down?" Daniel shook his head. "Never found a place that felt worth staying for. Until now." Ruth studied him carefully. "So why here, why us?" Daniel hesitated, then answered with quiet honesty. Because this place feels honest. Because you work hard and you don't lie. And maybe, because for the first time in a long while I see a family that stands together. Mary's eyes softened, but Ruth's expression stayed unreadable. You talk about honesty, she said. Then I need to ask you something that isn't easy. Have you ever done something you regret? Daniel looked down at his rough, calloused hands. The question cut deep. His voice was calm, but there was a tremor beneath it when he spoke. Yes, ma'am, he said. Once, years ago, I worked for a man in Colorado, a ranch owner named Carter. He didn't treat his workers right. One night, he struck a boy half my age for dropping a bucket. I stopped him, but it turned into a fight. He fired me the next morning and told the sheriff I'd started trouble. I left town before they could twist the story worse. I never raised a hand again unless it was to build something. The room went silent. Even the ticking of the clock on the wall seemed to stop for a moment. Ruth finally spoke, her tone softer than before. And do you still carry anger toward that man? Daniel shook his head. No, ma'am. I learned that holding anger just burns your own hands. I'd rather use them for work than for fighting. Thomas leaned forward, his eyes thoughtful. You did right to protect that boy, he said. There's no shame in that. Ruth didn't speak right away. She looked at her husband, then at Daniel, her eyes steady but no longer cold. So that's your truth? She asked quietly. Daniel nodded. Yes, ma'am. Every word. Ruth leaned back in her chair. For the first time since he'd arrived, she looked tired. Not weak, but as if the weight she carried had finally started to ease. Then you've proven what I needed to know, she said at last. Strength can build fences and fix roofs, but it can also destroy lives if it's not guided by honesty. You've shown me you have both strength and truth, and that's something this family can trust. Mary smiled, relief washing over her face. Thomas gave a satisfied nod, but Ruth wasn't done yet. She stood slowly and walked toward the window, looking out over the land. One last thing, Daniel, she said. If you're to stay here, you'll have to understand something. This ranch isn't just land and cattle, it's people, history, and hard lessons. If you ever hurt that trust, I'll be the first to send you away. Daniel stood respectfully. I understand, ma'am. And I'd never break that trust. Ruth turned, meeting his eyes. Good. Then you're welcome under this roof. It was a small sentence, but to Daniel it meant everything. For the first time in years, he felt a quiet sense of belonging, like a man who had finally come home after a long journey. Thomas stood and extended his hand. Welcome to Hollow Creek Ranch, son. Daniel took it firmly, gratitude shining in his eyes. Thank you, sir. Mary clapped her hands softly, smiling from ear to ear. Mama, you see? I told you he was different. Ruth gave a faint smile, the first real one Daniel had seen from her. You did, she admitted. And maybe for once you were right. That afternoon, the air around the ranch felt lighter. Daniel worked beside Thomas repairing an old gate near the barn, while Mary brought them cold lemonade from the kitchen. Even Ruth, standing on the porch, looked more at peace. But later that evening, as the sun set behind the hills, Ruth called Daniel over once more. Walk with me, she said. They walked quietly along the fence line, the grass whispering under their boots. The air was warm, filled with the sound of crickets. Daniel, Ruth said finally, you've earned my respect. But understand something. A man's worth isn't proved once. It's proved every day, in how he treats people, how he keeps his word, and how he faces hardship without turning bitter. Daniel nodded. I believe that, ma'am. She looked at him with a mother's steadiness. Then keep proving it. Not for me and for yourself, he smiled slightly. I will. They stopped by the new fence he'd built days ago. The wood stood straight and strong against the fading light. Ruth touched one of the posts gently. This fence, she said, reminds me of good men, solid, patient, and dependable. It may weather storms, but it doesn't fall. Daniel looked at her, understanding her meaning. Then I'll make sure it stays that way, he said. Ruth nodded, satisfied. Good. I think Hollow Creek has finally found another man it can trust. As night fell, the lanterns glowed softly across the ranch. Daniel sat outside the bunkhouse listening to the gentle hum of crickets and the laughter from inside the house. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like an outsider. He had worked hard, told the truth, and earned respect, not through loud words or showy actions, but through quiet honesty and perseverance, and somewhere deep inside, He knew this wasn't the end of his journey. It was the beginning of something better, something that might finally last. The days turned into weeks, and Hollow Creek Ranch began to feel like home for Daniel. The sun rose the same every morning, but now he woke with a quiet peace inside him. The air smelled of hay and warm earth, and the sound of horses in the barn greeted him like old friends. He had earned the respect of Thomas Granger and the quiet approval of Ruth. Mary often worked beside him, her laughter bringing a lightness that made even hard work feel easy. Every evening, after the day's chores were done, Daniel would sit on the porch with the family. They would talk about small things, the weather, the crops, the horses. Sometimes Ruth would ask his opinion about ranch matters, and every time she did, Daniel answered with careful thought. She liked that he didn't speak to impress, only to be honest. But one morning, peace at Hollow Creek was broken. A rider came fast from the north, dust rising behind his horse. He stopped at the front gate, breathless, and called out for Thomas. "Your cattle have broken through the east pasture fence," he shouted. "They're running toward the canyon." Thomas rushed out, his hat barely on his head. "The east fence?" he said sharply. "That storm must have loosened it again." Without a word, Daniel ran to the barn, saddled his horse, and was ready before anyone else. Ruth appeared in the doorway, worry etched on her face. "That's dangerous ground," she warned. "The canyon's steep." "One wrong move," Daniel nodded. "We'll bring them back, ma'am. I promise." He galloped out alongside Thomas and two ranch hands. The wind whipped past their faces as they rode hard toward the east pasture. The land sloped downward there, where grass gave way to rocky ground. In the distance, a small herd of cattle was scattered, moving dangerously close to the drop that led into the canyon below. "Spread out," Thomas shouted. "Keep them from going further." Daniel spurred his horse to the right, circling the frightened cattle. The animals were panicked from the broken fence and the echo of thunder that still lingered in the hills. Dust rose around them and the ground trembled with their hooves. "Easy now," Daniel called softly, his voice steady. "Easy, girls, come on." He rode low in the saddle, moving slow and calm, guiding the herd back toward safer ground. One wrong shout or fast move could send them running again. Thomas worked from the other side, and between them they started to close the gap. Then Daniel saw it. A young calf had slipped through the group and was heading straight toward the canyon edge. Without thinking, he turned his horse and galloped after it. "Daniel, wait!" Thomas shouted. But Daniel was already moving. The wind roared in his ears as he reached the frightened calf just before it reached the edge. He leapt off his horse, grabbing the calf's rope halter and pulling it back with all his strength. The ground beneath him gave a small crack, a warning. He froze. The soil was soft from the recent rain, and one wrong step could send both him and the calf over the side. Slowly, carefully, he dug his boots into the earth and backed away, inch by inch until solid ground met his feet again. When he looked up, Thomas was there, riding hard toward him. "You fool," Thomas said, his voice rough but his eyes full of relief. "You could have fallen." Daniel smiled weakly. "Wouldn't be much of a man if I let one small calf die on my watch." Thomas shook his head but clapped him on the shoulder. "You did good, son. Real good." Together, they guided the rest of the herd back to the fenced pasture. The sun was high by the time they finished, and everyone was covered in dust and sweat. But the cattle were safe, and the ranch was whole again. When they returned, Ruth stood waiting at the gate. She saw the dust on Daniel's coat, the tiredness in his eyes, and the dirt on his hands. She didn't ask what happened. She could read the story on his face. "You kept your word," she said quietly. Daniel nodded. "Yes, ma'am. The herd's safe, not one lost." Ruth's lips trembled slightly, and she looked away, hiding the emotion in her eyes. "Your father would have been proud, Thomas," she said softly. "And mine, too." That evening, the family gathered for supper. The mood was lighter than usual, filled with quiet pride and relief. Thomas lifted his glass. "To Daniel," he said. "A man who's proved himself more than once, not just with his hands but with his heart." Mary smiled brightly. "I second that." Ruth looked at Daniel across the table. "You've earned this family's trust, Daniel. You didn't just save the cattle. You showed what true strength looks like." Daniel looked down humbly. "I only did what was right, ma'am," Ruth smiled faintly. "And that's exactly why it matters." After dinner, as the stars came out, Daniel stepped outside to the porch. The night was calm, the fields glowing under the moonlight. He could hear the soft rustle of the wind through the trees and the quiet breathing of the horses in the barn. Mary joined him a few minutes later, holding 2 mugs of warm coffee. She handed him one and sat down beside him. "You've changed things around here," she said softly. Daniel smiled. "I don't know about that." "I do," she said. "Mama doesn't trust Easy. But she trusts you now. That means something." Daniel looked out over the land. The fences he'd built, the pasture he'd helped fix, the sky that stretched endless above them. "It means more than I can say," he whispered. For a long moment they sat in comfortable silence, listening to the sound of crickets and the distant call of a night bird. The ranch, once just a place to work, had become something more. A home, a family, a new beginning. The next morning, Ruth called Daniel to the porch. She held a small brown envelope in her hands. "This is for you," she said. Daniel took it, confused. Inside was a piece of paper, a work agreement with his name written neatly in ink. "You've earned a permanent place here," Ruth said. "No more traveling from ranch to ranch. Hollow Creek needs men like you, men who don't run when life gets hard." Daniel's chest tightened with emotion. "Thank you, ma'am. I don't take that lightly." Ruth smiled, the kind of smile that came from deep understanding. "I know you don't." Thomas came out, clapping Daniel on the back. "Welcome to the family, son." Mary appeared behind them, beaming with joy. "Told you he'd pass all your tests, Mama." Ruth laughed softly, shaking her head. "Maybe I made them too hard," she said. "But a man worth trusting doesn't mind a hard road." As the sun climbed high, Daniel walked out to the field, watching the horses graze and the wind ripple through the tall grass. The land stretched far and free, but for the first time in years he didn't feel the urge to keep moving. He belonged here, among people who worked hard, spoke the truth, and stood together. The lessons he had learned at Hollow Creek Ranch would stay with him forever. That strength isn't just in muscles, but in patience. That honesty builds more than fences, and that sometimes family is not the one you're born into, but the one you earn. As the day faded, Daniel leaned against the fence he had built, the same one that had started it all. The wood was solid, weathered by wind and sun, but still standing straight and strong and there, just like the man who had built it. And as the evening light touched the land in gold, he smiled quietly to himself. He had come as a stranger looking for work, but now he was something more. A man who had proven his worth, found his place, and finally, after years of wandering, found where he truly belonged.